Hello, this is MonteCristo, and today we're going to do another Monte's Musings, talking about viewability or watchability in esports. Now, this topic has been coming up a lot recently because there have been debates I've seen in the League of Legends and Counter-Strike communities about Overwatch and how easy it is to view as a spectator. Now, this gets into a whole other variety of topics, which I find very interesting when we discuss esports when it comes to how easy it is for people to watch the games or the accessibility of new fans to be watching the games. And I think that there are communities in esports that are ignoring or glossing over many of the problems that watching their own games has, because we really have to think about when we go into a new esport and watch it, what exactly we need to know in order to watch the game, or what the difficulties surrounding observing a particular esport is, because none of them are particularly easy, especially compared to traditional sports. And a lot of that comes down to some questions. What is the burden of knowledge to be able to watch a specific esport, i.e., what do you need to know in order to enjoy it? What do you need to know about the game? How intricate does your knowledge have to be in order to even watch it at an entry level, much less be an informed viewer and watch it at a more advanced level? The ease of spectating in the game, how easy is it for the cameramen, as it were, to catch all of the action and what's happening? These are both very important aspects that you have to consider when we discuss the actual nature of watching a competitive title. So to start things off, I think personally for me that Counter-Strike Go is currently the easiest esport to watch from the casual person's perspective. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that, or has played into the fact that it's been on TV, on Turner, on TBS in America, and has been finding a growing audience on television, where people might just be flipping through the channels, but when they come upon Counter-Strike, it's by far, I think, the most accessible esport to view from a burden of knowledge perspective. And the reason why that is because even if you know nothing about video games, pretty much everybody can understand when they watch a match that the terrorists are trying to plant a bomb, the counter-terrorists are trying to stop it. And when you watch the action, you know what an AK-47 looks like from being a human being who knows about human issues and objects and guns that people use in the real world. So when you see a guy with a pistol shooting a guy with an AK-47 and winning that duel, it's exciting because you think, hey, maybe that guy shouldn't have actually won. So everything's on the table from a viewership. You see a team of 5 guys in CS on an eco round where they have a bunch of pistols, and you see 5 guys with ops and AK-47s, and you know that the underdog team is the one that has the pistol, so you can get excited if that team is actually able to take a round, right? It's easy to understand things like what grenades do, what flashbangs do, what Molotov cocktails do, and pretty much anybody can tune into a Counter-Strike team and at least intuitively grasp the concept. Also, just like in real life, when you get shot in the head, you pretty much die, and you're dead for the rest of the round, so there's no reviving except in intervals. Now, part of the problem with CSGO is that from a fundamental perspective, FPS games are the most difficult to observe because you're dealing with 10, or in Overwatch's case, 12 players on the map. And if you choose the wrong player's perspective, or you're not in a third-person cam above the action at the right time, you can miss some things. Now, with CSGO, it's very helpful that people don't respawn, so that there are fewer and fewer players on the map, and it becomes easier to observe the longer the round goes on. And the maps themselves have various choke points, so you're able to sort of figure out from the mini-map as an observer where the action is going to be taking place, so that you can hedge your bets and really make sure that you're in the right place at the right time. So CSGO for me, if a lay person encounters the game, it is by far the easiest to approach from real world knowledge, whereas we get into the fantasy games like Overwatch or League of Legends or Dota, and it becomes a lot more confusing, and it's up to the developers to really design characters that are intuitive about what they do. For example, a character like Caitlyn with a gun shooting from long range, you can sort of understand that. Or a character like Widowmaker who has a sniper rifle, you can sort of understand what her role is going to be. So when we get to MOBAs. Now, there are a lot of MOBA fans that I've noticed complaining about how hard it is to spectate other games, especially an FPS title like Overwatch. But I think what MOBA fans really don't understand is that their esports are popular because, for the most part, they're supported by very, very large player bases by being globally popular free to play games. And what I mean by this is that objectively, from a from from the burden of knowledge standpoint, MOBAs are actually the worst titles to watch. Now, from the spectating standpoint, they're among the best because you have the camera always above the action. Um, you have the mini map, so you know exactly where the action is going to take place. For the most part, you rarely will miss kills, rarely will miss team fights or big plays because you have a tool to know where to be on the map, and you always have a large screen that can encompass almost all of the action that takes place. So there's a huge advantage for MOBAs in that regard, where you don't have to worry about, oh man, do I put it from a like the character's first person perspective, or do I try and get above the action? Where is the action going to be exactly happening? Who's going to be getting these kills? Like, should I focus on the DPS player or maybe the tank player like in Overwatch? Because you never know exactly who's going to be doing big things in Overwatch, except sort of you focus on who has ults and who is likely to make those big plays. But still, it's significantly harder. But with MOBAs, first off, the interface for games like League of Legends and Dota is incredibly complex. In Dota, you even have graphs that are popping up to try and inform viewers about the game and show gold swings. These are all very complex pieces of information that seasoned viewers have, or players most likely, have gotten accustomed to looking at or understanding. Whereas if you were a layperson, one of the biggest problems with MOBAs that people tend to forget is that, for example, a level 1 Ashe with a Doran's blade looks visually identical to a 6-item level 18 Ashe. Even in one game to the next, one team's Ashe could be 0-10 and weak as hell when the game is ending, whereas the very next game, a team's Ashe could be 10-0 with huge amounts of items and a huge advantage in doing insane damage. And not to mention that there are well over 100 characters, champions in games like League of Legends, and many, many, many in Dota as well. And you have to have a basic idea of what all of these champions do in order to even sort of begin to understand what is unfolding on the screen. Because when 10 players have everything going at once, a team fight, all their abilities firing simultaneously, you have to know where they're coming from. Otherwise, it becomes quite confusing. So MOBAs really do suffer from a very high burden of knowledge, which seems, I think people have biases when they know a MOBA very well, because they don't start thinking about how much knowledge they even had to acquire in order to reach that point, even with clear design, where maybe an average person can understand like the Ashe shooting the big arrow and stunning people because the giant ice arrow is sort of intuitive, but it still, I think, takes a gamer to be able to look at that and understand it, whereas somebody who doesn't know video games at all would have a lot of problems. So I think MOBAs are floated in esports by the fact that they have very large player bases that understand the game, and not necessarily because they are in any way accessible to the layperson or to an average audience that just wants to tune in and start to understand the basics. They are very, very complex. Now, this is what also makes them beautiful to watch, and you could really appreciate the strategy that goes into it. But viewability, you take the burden of knowledge, which is super high, and then the observing necessary, which is pretty low, and sort of averages out in the middle, right? But it's not like League or Dota are anywhere near as easy to get into as a game like Counter-Strike. Even RTSs, for example, when you take StarCraft, first off, you have a lot fewer units in StarCraft than you do in a game like League of Legends in terms of diversity of champions versus diversity of unit selections. And you have the same sort of camera system in RTS, right? You're rarely going to miss any of the action. You can see if drops are coming in with medevacs, for example, in StarCraft 2, and know to focus over there. You sort of know when the big fights are going to be occurring. And from a visual perspective for the casual person, there's less to learn. And when you see a Colossus shooting lasers all over the field, you have an understanding that this is a much more powerful unit than a Zergling visually, especially when the Zerglings die quite quickly, because the clarity on design is very clear in a game like StarCraft 2, whereas in MOBAs, because of the number of characters and the various power levels that change with items, it gets very, very confusing. So StarCraft 2 and other RTSs, I think, are actually some of the more accessible games from a casual person's perspective, whereas StarCraft in particular, because if you get into Warcraft 3, which I used to cast, you get the items, you get the levels, you get the MOBA elements, which do make things more opaque if you are not a player of the game or not more educated on how the game should be played. Dota, for example, I watch the International. I tune into Dota events periodically throughout the year, and I still have no fucking clue what is happening in Dota 2. And I have cast a couple of different MOBAs now for years, and I find Dota very confusing with all its active items. As I said in my previous video talking about CSGO casting and why I think it's the best compared to other titles, part of this is that I think the Dota casters cater to a very hardcore audience only, which makes the game more difficult for somebody like me to understand who isn't well versed in Dota 2 at all. But part of that is just because MOBAs are just so damn hard to understand, whereas I've watched a lot of Counter-Strike Go, and I have a much better functioning knowledge of Counter-Strike Go as a viewer, even though I have never played either Dota 2 or CSGO, right? And I hadn't cast an FPS at all until very recently when I moved over to Overwatch. And this transitions also into the fighting games, because a lot of people, I've had arguments online on Twitter saying that CSGO is the easiest one to watch. Some people say games like Street Fighter are very easy to watch, which is true, again, from a camera perspective, because you don't even need observers, right? That's probably the easiest game out of them all to observe, because everything is always waiting for you there on the screen to watch. And you can understand from, again, a real world perspective that an uppercut is going to do more damage to an enemy character than, say, a jab. But then you get into, of course, all the crazy, weird stuff like fireballs and kind of strange characters in Street Fighter that are not necessarily intuitive about how much damage their abilities are going to do. And then you get into the very complex stuff where to truly appreciate the difference between an amateur and a professional player in Street Fighter requires actually a relatively high burden of knowledge, because you need to know what a character's frame cancels or like frame perfect moves are in games like Smash Brothers or Street Fighter. And that's not as visually apparent to a lot of casual fans. So I think there are some issues there as well. Now, to go back to Overwatch and why people are claiming that it's difficult to watch, because in many ways they're right, and it is. Part of it is the spectator system itself. So let's start at the beginning. First off, it's an FPS. FPSs are the hardest games to observe, period, that we have right now, really. So it falls into that trap first and foremost. And then second off, it doesn't have the same spectator functions that a game like CSGO has. There is no ability for people currently to go into the client and sort of pop into a particular player's perspective so they can watch from their favorite player's perspective for the entire game. So you have to watch it on a stream. And stream watching for Overwatch has had a lot of issues because in Overwatch, outside of Apex and the Overwatch World Cup, it's been hard to get tournaments with a lot, or MLG Vegas as well, with multiple good observers in the game. For example, at the Overwatch World Cup, there were 6 observers, and having 6 different perspectives while simultaneously recording all 12 players' first-person's perspective for replays in case the action was missed actually made the experience of watching Overwatch considerably stronger. So I think that part of it is the spectators developing their own skills and the directors of the streams and of the action knowing where to be, and that just takes time and experience. But also, for the most part, Overwatch has had very limited numbers of spectators in professional matches, which means that it's harder to get the angle that you want while action is unfolding, or to switch quickly to a different perspective. If you have a screen that has everybody on it, you're like, okay, no, then we need to switch to this camera right now. If you have fewer choices to select from, then it does limit your ability to observe the game well. And I think you do need probably 6 observers at least in Overwatch to deliver the highest quality product. And these people have to be trained, have to get a better sense of observing, and they have to have a very competent director who knows the game well behind them in order to deliver that experience. And we just haven't seen very much of that yet. But there's also other issues, such as the lack of a minimap. Now, this hurts casters like me and also the observers, because sometimes if a character is flanking, we don't even know what's happening because we can't see that character on the screen from a different player's perspective, and it's sort of a surprise when a big ultimate comes from behind, like Attack Visor. And a spectator mode minimap would help a lot in terms of better focusing the action, just like it does in League of Legends or in Dota or in CSGO, where you see certain map movements and you know, hey, that's where the action's going to happen. Even if it's a failed flank, you need to be able to catch that because that's the focal point. And when you compare this to traditional sports, esports are quite complicated because in traditional sports, typically there's a ball to focus on where all the action's following the ball, where in esports you have fog of war, where both teams have incomplete information, and there is no ball per se. But at least in Overwatch, and other esports titles, there are objectives, there's a payload, there's a capture point. So there is something, or towers, or the nexus, something to focus, or the bomb in CSGO, something to focus that around a little bit, but it's not always what you're going to be looking at in a game, because sometimes, for example, in CSGO, the location of the bomb is placed very far back and the action is happening much further forward, whereas in most traditional sports, that's generally untrue. The action mostly revolves around the ball. So with Overwatch, having the minimap there would increase viewability pretty substantially. And I think that these are the major problems. But what happens with Overwatch is that the burden of knowledge is actually a lot lower than I think most other titles, because you only have 24 characters right now in the game, 24 heroes. And for the most part, there's a visual language around these heroes that makes a lot of sense. You have Widowmaker with the sniper rifle, so you can think, okay, well, I know sort of what she's going to do. Not going to be so good at close range. You can see her with the hook shot, maneuverable, up on top, like trying to get the sniping in. Now, it's not always clear, because if you're a random person coming in and you see Tracer jumping around and rewinding, you have to know something about Tracer and the way she manipulates time, which is not a real-world analog like having a Desert Eagle versus having an AK-47 would be in CSGO. But I think it's clearer than most MOBAs because there are fewer abilities and there's fewer characters. Of course, many of the team fighting aspects that are confusing about MOBAs, like ults and very flashy team fights in Overwatch, still exist. But I think it's to a lesser degree. So I think these are factors in Overwatch that will be solved over time, partially by improved observing and improved directing. And I think one of the reasons why Blizzard has been so reluctant to really push esports prior to the start of their own league is they're aware of this, and they don't really want to make a hard push on the game until it's truly ready from a spectator perspective, both in terms of the quality and number of spectators and direction that they have, as well as implementing hopefully things like dedicated team colors, more clarity on visuals, the mini map for spectators, and all these features, maybe even in-game, in-client spectating from a chosen perspective with the casters piped in like you can have in Dota would be wonderful if that's going to be coming along. And I think that a lot of these early complaints are very valid for Overwatch and will be taken over time and integrated as part of the launch of the Overwatch League later this year. At least I really hope they are, if they want to be able to have the most successful launch possible. But I just wanted to approach this issue because I think there's been a lot of misinformation surrounding what exactly makes a game viewable, and people are not taking into consideration their own existing knowledge of other titles when discussing it, because I think MOBAs are very unclear, and it takes that big group of players in order to support that MOBA esport. Whereas somebody like me that's never played a game of CSGO has gotten really into watching and enjoying Counter-Strike because it's been much easier to understand, and at least the basic burden of knowledge for approaching that game and watching it is much lower. Even if I don't have an expert knowledge of that title, I feel like I'm still able to enjoy it because the burden of knowledge is pretty much the lowest out of all esports. So these are just things to consider when you think about esports moving forward and arguments that may be presented, because even though I think Overwatch is far from perfect right now as a spectator title, I think it can get there. And I think also it as a game is going to appeal to a broader audience of people who may not even know esports at all, just like we've seen CSGO do on Turner and on TBS. And that's something very valid to consider for the future. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. Catch you next time.